Hello everyone, and welcome to another mini version of Cat Conversations with Kylie Stedman again. Thank you so much for coming along, Kylie.
Thank you, pleasure to be here.
So do you want to give your credentials to begin with? Just tell people who you are, where you come from, what you're interested in, to give a little bit of background, and then we'll dive into why we're having this conversation.
Okay, simplest terms, I'm Australian, sort of. I've actually lived and, travelled around the world a fair bit, so I've kind of considered myself a bit of a global citizen, which is probably why now I'm particularly interested in global wicked problems, if you like. So I come from an educational background that's fairly scattered, from arts through psychology, political science, did a little bit of engineering, a little bit of law, a little bit of IT, that kind of thing. And I'm probably mostly self-taught, so me and formal education don't get on quite so well. So although I have a Bachelor of Arts, it's the only degree I've got.
Right.
And I'm what is apparently called a neo-generalist. So a neo-generalist is basically, well, in current terms, is focused probably just as much on understanding things from inside as from the outside, and breaking down silos and looking, across disciplines and so on. And that is in our crazy world where, everything is changing all the time. So,
yeah.
So anyway, that interest is that sort of the wicked problems, if you like.
And so, wicked problems, I've not heard that term before. What does that mean?
Oh, wicked problems. Okay, so wicked problems are ones that are really complex and that there is generally no simple answer to. And even more to the point, there's often no answer that can be delivered by just one body or one organisation. So, you can't rely just on government or just on individuals or just on, on private industry or just on NGOs. In some way you need, to get a lot of different stakeholders involved, and it keeps changing. So think complex adaptive systems, and a lot of the ones that we have to deal with now, like, climate change and the refugee problem and all that kind of thing, they're all fairly wicked problems.
Right. Okay, cool. So shall I say a bit about what facilitated this conversation, and then we'll dive into the subject matter itself?
Sounds like an excellent idea.
Cool. Okay. So I posted something on Facebook about the Yellow Jackets in France, trying to get a broader understanding of what was going on there, because all I was hearing from the news was about fuel price hikes and everyone in France going crazy. And I was like, I think there's probably a little bit more to it than that, and I don't know what it is. So let me find out what that might be. And I posted something on there that was explaining about how the white working class feel really disenfranchised. And the response to that was pretty epic, I think it's fair to say. Hey, Kylie. That some people... Yeah? Do you want to say a bit more about that?
No, well, I just read through them quickly last night, so I wasn't actually involved in any of that conversation. But at the same time, it's not an unpredictable conversation. There's a lot of things that we are accustomed to jumping to in terms of shortcuts and so on. So I think you could probably explain those couple of positions more deeply than I can. But.
Okay. So the two basic positions that came up were that's a really racist thing to say. You need to check your privilege and educate yourself about why white people have it so good. And the other response was, I'm not sure that that's right. Can we explore this a bit more? What about this? What about that? Which was a more constructive dialogue. And so as a result of that, Kylie and I were talking, and Kylie said something in that conversation along the lines of things. Oh, no, let me backtrack a bit, because I've missed out an important bit about. We were talking in terms of spiral dynamics of how I might be in a really good position to midwife people out of green into yellow, because I've spent so much of my life in green. So like I know it inside out and back to front, and how best to do that, how best to have conversations with people that help them see a broader perspective. And in that conversation, Kylie said something along the lines of, you can probably say this better than me, things that we think are going to help have the opposite effect, and things that we don't expect to help often can. So that's what sparked me to, let's have this conversation then, because I'm curious about what we're trying to do in goodwill that might have a negative effect, and what we're ignoring that we're just discounting as irrelevant that might have a positive effect. So would that be a good place for you to pick up, Kylie?
Yeah. Well, I can give actually probably a really simple example of one of the things that at least some people think might help, but that has the opposite effect. So putting up a border wall, an example, because all that happens with that is that people then have to, because they're still trying to get away from something and get somewhere else. So it just means that they take more dangerous paths, that they'll end up doing the things like trying to go around it, or, they'll end up drowning at sea, or they end up like bribing people, or they get involved in traffic, or, whatever the case may be. It's like they end up being involved with criminal elements, which just makes the whole situation worse. You know what I mean? It doesn't actually keep people out or discourage, because it's not as much discouragement as being shot at. Which I suppose it's a very blunt way of saying that, but yeah, if you're running for your life, then who cares about a wall?
Right. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So from the perspective of the people who are in a host country, it seems like it's good. It's doing something to keep people out. But from the perspective of of the refugees who are trying to get away from something that's really bad, it's just an inconvenience.
Yes, yeah, and something to be overcome no matter what. I'm wondering if we need to make a bit of a link here between our jump that seems quite familiar now between the yellow vest in France, or Trump, or Brexit, and talking about immigration. I mean, some people might be like, where's that come from?
Yes, good point. You explain that one.
Thanks. Okay, so I guess something that has been leveled at people who vote Trump or Brexit or are yellow vest is that they are, the way of explaining how all that happened is to say that those people must be racist and xenophobic and want to exclude other people from enjoying the comforts and liberations of being in a Western country. And so, and with that explanation, there's no need to look deeper. And I guess my contention is that it doesn't seem rational to me to explain that by saying that suddenly, like, maybe 1% of people who are actually racist suddenly exploded to 50%. That doesn't make sense to me. And if that is what happened, I need a causal relationship to back that up. And I've forgotten my second point. Bugger.
Have that effect on people.
Yeah. Maybe it will come back later because it was a good one.
If it occurs to you, interrupt.
Yeah, okay, I will do. But yeah, I guess that's why talking about immigration is a natural follow-on for us now, because that accusation is leveled at people who do those weird things like voting Trump, Brexit, yellow vest. Yeah? Does that say it fully enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It certainly explains like how we got to doing the things that you think are going to work and having them not work.
Yes.
And
yeah.
Versa.
I guess the only other thing to say before we jump into what will and won't work is that at the moment in popular dialogue, let's say, there's two very polarized positions. Either you're not racist and you want to open your borders to everyone, or you are racist and you want to close them and not let anyone in. And it's like, no, there's quite a lot of middle ground in there. I love what Douglas Murray says about I love my country and I love other cultures. I just want to protect my country so that it remains my country and has other people coming in with their gifts and beauty and whatever, but not to the extent that my country is drowned out of existence, kind of thing. You know, what is our capacity? No. So, yeah.
Well, the capacity to incorporate. So if we think of it not so much as a full country, but just imagine that you've got a group of 4 people, right? And they've got their own norms and their own way of doing things kind of set up. If another 1 or 2 people come along, then they can be assimilated, not like the Borg, but you know, but they can sort of be brought in and made to feel part of the group that was there. But if you bring 20 people along, then it has to turn into something else. Do you know what I mean? Like those 4 people can't push their cultural, you know, their group norms out on make it the full 24, or at least certainly not easily. So it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it kind of gives that picture, I think, that you know, it's like there's limits to how much you can influence or how much you can hold a center of gravity, which is basically what, you know, what culture is. I think it's you know, it's a set of expectations and norms and familiar stuff and so on. So yeah.
Okay. So from there, sorry, go on.
I was just thinking maybe that's where that the space in between those 2 extreme positions is.
Yes. Yeah. Asking those questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I guess maybe we need to put that aside for a little while and say, so once we've somehow sorted out what our capacity is and how much we want to include and what we want to retain, what are the best ways of going about that? And you were saying that walls and stuff just kind of don't work. So could we jump to what does work, or why that? Well, I guess we've touched on why that doesn't work, but what's the next step after that? Or would you like to give some more examples of what we think will work but blatantly doesn't?
I think let's bring the examples up sort of as they arise.
Okay.
But I think that some of it's about the approach that you might take, and looking at lots and lots of different perspectives is one of the first things to be able to get a good picture of it. You know, it's like, you know, that story of like the person, the guys that are around the elephant and they're all blindfolded.
Yes.
And you know, like one's feeling the trunk and going, oh, it's a tree, or you know, it's a snake. And someone else is, you know, like with the tail, and someone else is with the leg, and you know, they can all fight about it, or you can kind of go, okay, well, let's put all these things together and then see if we can sketch in what this thing might actually be. And I think it's the same with something with anything that's as complex as a refugee crisis. Is that you've got so many different players and so many different perspectives, and you sort of go, well, why are people doing what they're doing? So you hear about, you know, some people are, or a certain number are more like economic migrants, as opposed to, you know, like war refugees. So why would an economic migrant be going somewhere else? Because they feel like they can't make a life where they've come from. I mean, or at least that makes sense, so that they're going to be so much better off where they're going to. So then why might they have that idea? You know, to some extent, it might be that they don't actually have a clear picture of what's going to be expected of them in that place. They might not know whether they're going to be accepted or not. You know, there might just not be a clear story at all, which I think has certainly been the case. It was certainly the case in like 2015 or so, I think, when there was a bit of an uproar about it. So it's kind of looking at that and going, okay, well, once you've worked out what's underlying the behavior or what people are doing, then you kind of go, well, okay, is there a way to incentivize what you want,
Right.
and what you don't want, that is actually speaking to the underlying need of the people who are behaving in some way.
Yes.
Yeah, and look at it from their perspective. And some might be, for instance, for migrants, if what they're struggling with is that they don't have enough opportunities where they've come from, maybe we can do something to make it so that there are opportunities where they've come from. So that there's a preference for staying there.
Yes.
Instead.
Yeah.
If you've got unclear stories that's making it look like, if they come to the UK that they're basically going to be sitting on welfare, and the more kids they have, the more they're going to get paid, or I'm being ridiculous, but if that's the picture that's there. One of the expressions that I saw somewhere, sorry, I'm just going to have to find it because I don't remember these things off the top of my head. So apparently scribbled on some wall in one of these camps, it says, "European hell is better than Africa's paradise."
Right.
If that's the story that they've got, then why wouldn't you want to go?
Yeah. Wow, that's really quite powerful, isn't it?
I think it's extremely powerful. Yeah. And especially if their version of what European hell looks like is sort of based on, like American TV shows.
Yeah. First world problems and that.
Like everyone has their own car, and it's a new car, and
yes.
And then you look at them and they're all complaining and groaning about stuff, and you go, yeah, well, if that's their version of hell.
Right. Yeah. But it's not understood, and unless you're actually living it, it's not understood the hellish aspects that can underlie that, and the beauty and the paradise that can be in an African situation that you don't acknowledge until you move away from it. It's the same with anything, isn't it? You don't appreciate what you've got until you've lost it, and you don't know what you're jumping to until you're there.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, it's all ideas, isn't it? It's all perceptions.
Yeah.
So yeah, if they think they're going somewhere that's far better for a life, and that's going to be possible for whatever reason, why wouldn't you? Yeah.
I know it's in our own mythology about people going to London, traveling from the countryside into London because the streets were paved with gold.
Wow, they were they?
Apparently.
I'm sure that there was a rumor like that got so many people over here in Australia as well.
Right. Yeah.
Down there.
The beer's great.
I don't know if they even got to the point of beer at that point. That's liquid gold. That was what they made them feel better about when they did it.
True. Okay. So tell me more about this idea that things that we think will work don't, and things that we don't think will work might. That intrigues me.
Yeah. Well, can you bring up something else that you hear people say that they think will work?
Now I'm thinking I should have prepared. No, all I'm thinking of at the moment is the argument between the left and the right, and that the basis of that argument being something along the lines of the left saying we need to take care of people, otherwise they'll fall through the gaps, and the right saying, yeah, but how are you going to pay for it? And we need a good economic structure in order to keep this ball rolling, otherwise it's going to fall apart. So that's not exactly what's going to help, what's going to make things work. But is there anything in that you can pull upon?
Well, I suppose I've gone to a very abstract place in my head, but I'll share this just because it's there.
Yeah.
Which is that that right side argument, which is saying how are you going to pay for it? It's all head without heart. And the left-handed side, or the left side of taking care of people, is all heart without head.
Yes.
And I think we know individually, if you make a decision like that in your life, that's just all one way or all the other way, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it's much the same with dealing with a problem like this, which is even more complex than just the decision that you make in your own life. So so basically, right wing is right when they say you can't just sort of take on board. So just to steal some figures from Amnesty International, 22 million in 2015. You can't just say, yes, okay, we'll just take 22 million refugees in our country, right now, overnight. Because they need to be looked after. Right? We can't even do that in Australia. It's like, it's a big country, but most of it is, uninhabitable, basically.
So, Red hot rock.
Yeah. So you couldn't tax people enough to pay for it. You couldn't, like the infrastructure wouldn't be there to cope with it. Nothing would be there to cope for it. So, clearly that's not it. You can't go down that extreme. On the other side, if you don't take anybody, if nobody takes anybody, it's basically a death sentence for them. And we want to consider ourselves to be, caring, decent human beings that look after our own. We're social creatures, and even if we go down that path, this isn't just a case of we haven't lived up to our image. I think for instance, the worst post-traumatic stress disorder comes from people who have actually had to kill someone else.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Not
shock of what we're capable of.
What's that? Sorry.
It's the shock of being made aware of what we're capable of. Yeah,
absolutely. There's cognitive dissonance that sort of you like to be a good human being, and then you do something like that, and then you've got to somehow reconcile it.
Yeah.
When one of us hurts, we all hurt.
Yeah.
So it's, you need to put both heart and head. Yes,
and I guess in my terminology, that's both the masculine head and the feminine heart. And I guess that, again, it's a bit left field, but it cues into what I've been saying about the patriarchy. Is there a patriarchy? And my opinion is that no, there isn't, but that masculine qualities have been more valued in the last, couple of thousand years plus than feminine values. And it feels like politically that's shifting at the moment, but into a very immature feminine place, which is just kind of dogmatic. Like, well, that's the way I want it to be. That we take in everyone, for example, and look after them, because that's just what we need to do. So it's all heart, it's all that feminine inclusion without any of the masculine. Okay, let's figure out how we're going to do this, what we can do and what we can't do, and what's the best way to go about it and whatnot. So all in favour of that combination of masculine and feminine, head and heart, and that maps onto everything, doesn't it? Like borders, the openness versus the closedness, rather than being all one or all the other, having some sort of semi-permeable membrane.
Yes, and it's about the boundary conditions in that membrane. And also, if you think about every country as having its. Sorry, I'm way off on an analogy here, so tell me if I'm not making any sense. If you think about every country as having its own membrane and its own boundary conditions, the question that ends up coming out there is that from the position of a refugee, how do you know where to go or what to do? It's like, they're not exactly in the position to be able to read through the latest laws.
Yes, yeah.
100 different countries.
Yes. And the situation has been changing in countries as well. I was reading in Douglas Murray's book about how things were changing and how, because it really crossed my mind, like, how do people get to know where to go, and how do they manage to make that journey? Because there's so many people making that journey. And Douglas was describing, because he's been over there and seen it with his own eyes, or at least the receiving of people coming over in boats, and saying that it's kind of a business. You know, people in North Africa and whatnot on the coast are charging extortionate amounts of money for refugees and economic migrants to jump in a boat that's really not fit to sail and start off on this journey, anticipating that the UN or whoever will be there to receive them. So the boat doesn't even need to be good enough to make the whole journey. So it's like the image I had in my head before reading that book was that, you know, people suddenly kind of miraculously thought, oh, I know what the solution to my problem is. I'm going to move west, and kind of walking along a lonely track with no one else around and trying to find a boat and getting in it and going across the water. And it's actually not like that. It's like, you know, I guess now the image that is more appropriate is like everyone in Spain going on holiday in August. You know?
Yeah.
And it's like business.
A process ends up getting set up, whether it's a good process or a bad process. You know, there's I think some of those countries at some points, I think that you know, like the trafficking refugees was actually one of their major, you know, economic activities.
Right.
So it's like they regarded themselves as business people.
Yeah, kind of. It makes sense, and it's really fucking weird at the same time. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, that was very pithy.
Thank you.
Yeah, well expressed. So yeah, I mean, people, like, if you think about how you make decisions yourself, like half the time, it's like you get to a point where you go, I'm not doing this anymore. Whatever this happens to be. And then, you know, when you're looking for what I'm going to do instead, sometimes it will be the first thing I hear that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, or sometimes it will be, oh, you know, I planned this, you know, like however many years ago. But the more stressful the circumstance, the less likely it is, in a way, that you know, gone and plotted everything out.
Right.
And that's that these people are in, by and large. So yeah, they're going for whatever the latest coherent, hopeful story is.
Yes.
That, you know, that they've heard.
Yeah. I wonder how many people have kind of made it to the West and are now thinking, like, I'm not sure I agree with that Western hell being better than African paradise anymore. I think it's pretty crappy here, actually. It's cold, apart from anything else.
Well, that's one of the things that'd be really interesting, is to talk to people who have been sort of accepted in as refugees, and just say, what would you say to the people who are, you know, in the place that you left?
Right. Yes.
You know, what advice would you give? You know, what would you say that's different about, you know, what you ended up with compared to what you expected? So start trying to craft a story.
Yeah, that would be interesting to hear.
With them. So that could be interesting, and that's one of those things. It's like, you wouldn't think that a story would make any difference, but I actually think that it might.
I think that would be a really powerful thing. Again, you know, imagining myself in a situation in Sudan or whatever, I can imagine a story of redemption or heaven, you know, over the border would be very appealing. So yeah, if I heard the opposite story coming back, a bit more realistic, that might change things. Makes sense.
Yeah. Well, even if it was just something that was saying, you know, it's hard. Like, everything that you do every single day is difficult. You know, even when you're doing it with money and skills and all of that kind of thing. You know, I lived in the Netherlands for a couple of years with my husband. I didn't actually learn how to speak Dutch, which is terrible of me. But but there was that thing that even though, like, it's a Western country as well, and it's really not that different in in a huge number of ways. There was still like maybe say 10 to 15% burden on pretty much everything, like cognitive burden on like that street names are really long.
Right.
Street names. Or like when people are very kindly speaking English to me, I have to listen really, really hard because of the accent.
Right. Yeah.
That supermarkets aren't set out the same way as I'm accustomed to. And for me at that time, like we've actually just gotten rid of plastic bags here recently, but at that time, like that you had to take your own bag.
Right.
It was just all these things that were just that little bit different. And I just think how much more difficult must it be to like to refer to the spiral, to actually leap to not only a different country, a different language, different geographical layout than what you're accustomed to, but also to a place that is in a completely unknown level of complexity.
Yes.
So they're going from something that's red or blue, so level 3 or 4, to things that are at 5 or 6.
I remember Ayaan Hirsi Ali talking about that dissonance when she moved, I think it was from the Sudan to the Netherlands, and seeing people go up to a policeman to ask the time, and no bribery or beating up happening. She found that absolutely miraculous. And then standing at a bus stop which had a cover on it so she didn't get wet, and a digital display saying to the second when the bus would turn up, and it did, and her just saying it felt utterly incredible to her, like living on a space station or something.
A bus showing up on time, I have to admit, that would feel pretty much like me.
We are talking Netherlands.
Yeah, I suppose they're reasonably close to Switzerland, aren't they? Yeah, definitely makes a difference. But yeah, so, and that kind of leads into something else that I think is that we probably need to do that we don't really at the moment, which is to profile where people's values and expectations and their cultural patterns, where they actually are.
On the spiral, you mean?
Yeah. So if they've come through and they're accustomed to living within and dealing with like a blue level of complexity, to place them into a green environment is going to be difficult for both. And make it more difficult because they don't have the language, they don't have the skills necessarily to fit within there either. I think it's going to be tricky. So if there was a bit of a mapping that was done, so people were highly educated in themselves. I mean, there's nothing to say that that someone who's coming from let's say Nigeria, that they have to be at red or blue. They may actually be at orange or green or yellow themselves as an individual, which means that for host countries, they probably would slide most easily into a target that was at the same level of development as they are themselves.
Yeah.
But I don't think anything like that is done.
No.
Really at all.
Yeah.
There's no culture is there.
No, not that I'm aware of. And I think that's a big criticism, that, it's just expected to happen naturally, that, as soon as people breathe British air, they become British or something. And I think that attitude is more present in the States, that people are seen as American primarily, rather than over here we have profile forms that ask whether you consider yourself to be white British, white Irish, Afro-Caribbean, Asian. So, nowhere on there is it Black British or Asian British. Do you see what I mean? There's a subtle difference there about Britishness is never achieved or something. So yeah, I think there's less cohesion there in perhaps the American model, which is where you can state much more powerfully, I am American, you know, no matter what your ethnic background.
Yeah, actually, I'm just thinking we don't really do that. We don't do that ourselves. We don't say like an Italian Australian or something.
What do you say?
People will pick one on the other.
Right. Okay.
You know, so occasionally I'll come across people who say, "Oh, yes, you know, my family is Italian." You know, and,
right.
But the whole family might have actually moved to Australia, you know, a generation earlier.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I have to admit it's mostly just Australian is Australian. So
right. That's it. Yeah. Simple.
Anyway, I feel like we're sidetracked there. What's that about?
Yeah, let's get back on track. What is the track anyway?
Just thinking about different ways to look at it, so that you know you might get towards something like a solution.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, we were talking about the membranes and boundary conditions before.
Yes.
Now, imagine if there was one membrane that basically was checking out whether people were actually refugees or not.
Right. Yeah.
So one set of rules.
Around the globe, you mean?
Yeah, one processing center, if you like. So rather than each country fighting over who was going to take people, to say we'll take this many people and these are our conditions, and then having this other sort of independent body, if you like, doing those assessments, and you know, reaching those quotas, if you like.
So you said one membrane being of that ilk. Are you imagining other membranes kind of layered over the top of that as well?
So within it. So from the perspective of the refugees, they've only got one thing that they need to think about, and then you've got a central sort of admin processing body that then worries about all of the other conditions that might exist in subparts of that overall membrane, if you like. So, okay, I'll go away from the analogy, and just within, so one administration body that has one intake rule from refugees, and then after that, what they're doing is they're matching between the refugee and the appropriate host country, according to the host country's rules. What they will and won't accept, and according to the preferences and the needs and everything else of the particular refugee in question.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm just trying to think what the objections to that might be. I guess it would mean universal agreement on what constitutes a refugee. Would that be particularly difficult to, is that in place already to an extent?
I think that there's at least a loose agreement on what constitutes a refugee.
Hold on just a tick, I'm being asked a question. Do you have any cash? Yes. In here. Okay. You going out? Yeah. Okay, I'll see you later. Yes, you love me. Sorry, yes, back in the room.
That's right. So you're looking for objections to doing that, and whether there was a definition of what a refugee is. I have a feeling that the UN did have one that people were largely, or various countries were largely in agreement with. I have seen some news that I haven't read lately, but just headlines saying that there's something that the UN has released on migrant policy recently. Right. So I'm not sure what that is, but I do know that Australia was one of the ones that decided not to sign it.
Right. Okay.
I don't know what that's about yet. That's just fine. So I don't think it's exactly settled, but I don't think it's that far off either.
Okay, not a massive hurdle. Yeah. And then I imagine the other objection would be that individual nations would say, but I want it to be, we want immigration to happen on our terms rather than any central body. But it sounded like your proposal took that into account. So any country could say, okay, this is how many people we're willing to accept in a year, and these are the requirements that we have, something like that.
Yep.
Yep.
And there's nothing saying that you couldn't have sort of an extra kind of layer in the background there, where that sort of central administration body kind of pulls all the information together and then presents it to whoever in that proposed host country, and get a final veto on it if for some reason they kind of went, no, I really don't think that's appropriate, or something. But instead of each country having to do its own processing of everything, to instead have one central intake, and then it's just a case of matching as much as possible.
Yeah, it sounds damn sensible, Kylie. Let's do it. Can we just do it?
What I'm thinking is, why hasn't anyone done it yet? Because it seems like fairly, I don't know, seems a bit like a no-brainer to me, which is always dangerous. If something seems like a no-brainer, it's because like the person who came up with it has no brain.
Sorry, hang on a sec. Sorry, what was that?
What about if I do the key? Show you what we do?
You won't need a key at all.
Okay.
We'll just be here, and I'll leave it unlocked if we're not.
All right.
Okay. See you later. Love you too. Have fun. Thank you.
Sorry, I just paused for a sec while I drink, because
getting rid of.
I think I'm going for something. It's only water, but whatever.
Sorry, where were we?
We were talking about no-brainers and how dangerous they are.
Yes, yeah, and I do get what's the word? I think I must have it oversimplified if it feels like a no-brainer. So I'm wondering whether the sheer numbers involved or something make it a lot more complex than we're suggesting it might be. Because on the face of it, it does seem like a no-brainer.
Yeah, I suspect some of it is probably that maybe the UN is trying to do something like that, but in a similar manner to the Global Commons Trust that we talked about last time. I'll come back to that one briefly. That because the UN is an international body and not a global body, that it ends up being a bit difficult, because you don't have, the different nations don't have equal power, or at least they don't feel that they have equal power. So there's a lot of distrust and jockeying for control and competition and so on that goes on, which probably makes it very difficult to collaborate fully.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
So it may just need to be something other than the UN.
Which brings us on very nicely to your Global Commons idea, yes?
Yes, I have to admit, the Global Commons Trust, I hadn't particularly seen that as the thing to be dealing with the refugee crisis.
Right.
But I think there are some similarities in that, even if it's not so much now when we've got extra refugees from climate refugees, let's say, that it's a global issue.
Are we beginning to see climate refugees yet?
I think to some extent that's a matter of opinion or definition.
Right.
I would suggest yes. I think it's interesting that the areas that you're seeing so much of this fighting going on are in places where basically you're ending up with famines because of changing weather patterns. So it could be a little bit of a stretch, but I would say yes, you probably are already.
Right.
And then we're going to end up with more, because you've got those Pacific islands that are under threat from the water, and Also within countries as well. Like I think Florida in the US has a fair bit of trouble with water coming up in the streets through the drains, like backwash.
Right.
And so on. So other low-lying areas will have problems. It's okay if people can sort of deal with that within their own country. But others, I think, Bangladesh is one that's going to have a lot of trouble with it because it's quite low-lying. I think, I'm not sure, it might have been 30% or something of it is sort of expected to go into water at some point.
Right.
So yeah, so there'll be more and more. But at any rate, that at that point, whatever that happens to be, whether it's in the past or still to come, it's a global issue. It's not an international issue. This is people.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, I'm sort of showing my my thoughts on. Yeah, just humans, please.
Yes. Yeah, that really makes sense. And it feels very different from, like, I know some people are concerned at the moment that, like, Europe will kind of expand and there'll be a one world government, and that's really bad and evil and stuff. And it feels like what you're suggesting is the equal opposite to that, a recognition that we're all people who live on the same planet and that we want the best for everyone. And that includes, us living in our own countries and everything else. Whereas I guess the narrative from the very far left is like, we need to feel guilty about who we are and what we've done in the past and make up for it by including the rest of the world. And if we destroy ourselves in the process, then so be it, kind of thing.
Yes, which does no one any favours in the long run, does it?
No. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I really like how that argument kind of turns and flips on itself in the end. The argument that I've been receiving of how can you be so racist and xenophobic and want to exclude, and it's like, well, actually no, I want to preserve what we have so that we are in a position to continue to be able to receive, to include. So yeah, that I'm really appreciating how that argument, rather than contributing to the divide, actually brings people together ultimately.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to what we were saying before about the number of people that can be integrated into a group or into a culture or into a country. The more distance you've got in culture, the more effort to go in order to integrate. So the more education, the more inputs, if you like.
Yeah.
So like you could easily integrate 5 people who already spoke English and already had recognised British degrees in a professional setting. Doesn't matter where they come from. Like race is absolutely irrelevant to that. Compared to one person that you actually had to, take the whole way through an education system and teach them English and, explain how, whether it's cars or something like that, how the whole of modern life works.
Yes.
You need the same amount of effort to integrate them as the other 5 professionals. It's not even about numbers. Yeah.
But I'm thinking, as you speak, I'm thinking that there's something unique about Islamic immigration in that there's also hasn't been yet a separation between church and state, or religion and state. So do you think that adds another layer of complexity onto that? How close are the two cultures? What's the similarity there, and what needs to happen beforehand in order to make that assimilation successful?
I think it's going to depend again which branch of Islam you're talking about. I think some are a lot more familiar, or their position on things is a lot more familiar to the West than others. So, you know, there are absolutely Islamic countries where women have pretty near the same kind of rights as we're accustomed to.
Which ones are you thinking of?
To be honest, I'm thinking of a friend of mine who actually has a fair bit to do with students that come out to Australia from the UAE, from Saudi, and so on. And you know, she's got the full range. Let's say, or she notices the full range.
Okay.
Some she's like, you really couldn't tell the difference from any other Australian. And others, it's you know, it's within every word and within every, you know, piece of body language and every way of looking at everything.
Right.
So yeah, so it's not quite so straightforward as there being one that's real, you know, that it's all really different. I think some is and some's not, but it's a bit the same as like I would say Christianity is a bit the same.
Yeah.
You know, you get your you know, you get your zealots.
Yes. Yeah.
They're very different from people who are looking at it and going, okay, well, just think of these as being, you know, metaphors or as stories that contain some kind of truth in them that you know, we can use no matter when, so long as we, you know, look at it with the abstract enough perception. And I think the same thing can be done with Islam.
Yes. Yeah. And maybe taking into account as well the Wahhabism drive that started back in the 70s, and how Wahhabism, how that it started off in Saudi Arabia and was like deliberately exported from the 1970s onwards as a way of trying to get the very traditional, as in, you know, 12th century version of Islam out to Islamic countries. So countries that were pretty progressive, if you like, in terms of their attitudes to apostates, to gays, to women, actually regressed or have regressed since the 1970s as a result of this Wahhabi push.
So almost like a fundamentalist push.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, fundamentalism is going to make it further away from, from UK culture.
Yeah.
Away from Australian culture. But oh yes, I want to throw another statistic in there that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
So with all of the 22 million odd refugees that there are worldwide, or at least that there were in 2015. In 2015, 84% of them were hosted by low and middle income countries near their own.
That's a really interesting figure. Yeah.
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 And they're struggling, you know, because our richer countries are not providing the financial support often that was promised or, you know, said that we were going to in terms of, I suppose, foreign aid, the UN to help out with this. So so those countries are really feeling the brunt of it.
Right.
That said, they're a lot more culturally similar. And so, you know, in a way, I suppose it's dealing with that issue of making sure that the values are similar and that, you know, that they integrate and so on. So
yes, yeah. And I guess it makes sense that if most people want to remain near their home and move back home when they can, that it makes economic sense for us to help them do that rather than bring them into our own country as a first port of call, because the statistics on repatriation are like minimal, right? Okay.
I'm just going to jump back on that Global Commons Trust thing very briefly. Because one of the key things in there was to charge rents and fees on our common inheritance, if you like. So that could be the things like oil and coal and, you know, fossil fuels to start off with, and then distribute as dividends to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So with some basic income coming in,
Mm-hmm.
one wonders whether people might feel less inclined to leave
Mm-hmm.
and a home that they know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that might be survivable,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with some income than they are at the moment. So it's kind of a removing some of the pressure to
Yes.
leave.
Yeah. I can't imagine though countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, saying, "Oh yes, we'll pay a dividend on our oil and let that be shared out amongst the whole planet."
See, I wouldn't be doing it by country.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, it would be going onto the actual stock exchange in the first place. So
Right.
for oil in particular, actually, interestingly, a lot of the other oil companies have been, jumping up and down and basically saying, please, a carbon tax would be nice.
Really?
Yeah, because they have to divest. They have to be able to switch from what they're using at the moment to something else.
Right.
While we're in the kind of situation that we are at the moment,
Mm-hmm.
where everyone's fighting over whether climate change is even real, they don't know where to invest.
Right.
I mean, solar's maybe a good idea. Wind is maybe a good idea, or maybe they should be looking at natural gas, or maybe they should be looking at the biofuels that you can get from algae, or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. But they've got no particular reason to put money in for innovation
Mm-hmm.
until they have some idea of where to put it. Like, it's one of those cases of, put yourself in the shoes of a CEO of, say, BP.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think when you look around?
I guess my initial thing would be to put a little bit of money into everything and see what's really cooking.
Yeah, although that's going to be difficult because you don't know what people are going to go for.
Mm-hmm.
You have some idea of what the, to paint with a broad brush, you have some idea of what the greenies are going for.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't know what other people are going to choose. It's like people who have enough money will go and buy a Tesla.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Vehicle, but what about the people who don't have enough?
Mm.
At what point are they going to go, okay, well, instead of, well, we can't afford an electric vehicle, so we're going to go for carpooling.
Yeah, right.
Or or maybe they'll go for buses, or who knows.
Mm.
So I think for anyone who's slightly long term thinking,
Mm-hmm.
they know that they have to change.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it'd be kind of nice to have an idea of what they need to do. But anyway, there's a few of them that are actually doing this.
Doing the carbon tax.
Yeah, or asking for it.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. What, in order to conduct research, or in order to give this money globally that you were talking about?
Just well, the way that they're expressing it, and this is all PR, of course, is saying, like, we want to help. We want to get off fossil fuels,
mm-hmm.
and this is the way that we do it. This is the way that would make it easier for us to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
cool, amazing. I
think Mobil do something like that. Woodside Petroleum have done something like that. I think Shell has.
Right.
There's a few of them.
It's so weird that, especially coming from the left and coming from the green meme, that it's very much in my consciousness about Shell, Survival International, highlighting that Shell and BP were literally murdering people in South America to get them off the land so that they could start drilling and digging and whatnot. So that's my understanding and perception of those kinds of companies. And then to hear that they're asking for a carbon tax in order that they can make that transition more smoothly, it's like almost brain explodes. I don't know what to do with that dissonance of information.
Yep. I think everyone has their own point at which they look at things differently. You know, I come from a country that is basically dependent on you know, exports of coal.
Mm-hmm.
There is still a lot of what you might call climate denial here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have a prime minister who at one point was tossing around a lump of coal in Parliament to tell people that they shouldn't be afraid of it.
Right.
You know, so for me, I actually was probably what you would call not actually a climate denier, but a skeptic. I just didn't know what to think.
Mm-hmm.
Until about 2010.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, once I actually did look at it and go, oh yeah, there's actually something here that needs to be considered. And you know what? Even if it's not us, we still actually have to adapt.
Mm-hmm. Not us as in maybe we're not to blame for it, but there's still something going on that needs responding to.
Yeah, it's like even if we're only responsible for 10% of what's going on, we still have issues that we actually have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
We have brittle infrastructure.
Yeah, say a bit more about that, because we spoke about that before and it was like, what do you mean brittle infrastructure? And it really helped to understand what that actually means.
Oh, okay. Okay, imagine what happens in the UK if all of the power goes out for 3 days. What happens if fuel supplies for 2 days?
Mm-hmm.
How many people are actually still going to be eating? Or, you know, who's going to be getting sick from water that's not actually fit to drink, you know, from poor sanitation? You know, like what kind of social breakdown might there be in terms of looting or whatever else? So it's just that we've got all these really tightly linked processes, many of them just in time. So, you know, supermarket shelves get stocked overnight. You know, if they don't have the thing for a while, they say, oh, sorry, this item is temporarily unavailable. Well, if none of the trucks can get through, it's not going to be a couple of items. It's going to be everything. So yeah, so that's basically what I mean. It's that we've sort of set everything up to be efficient in doing the same thing over and over again, and we don't have we don't have fail safes. We don't have if plan A fails, we'll go to plan B. You know, generally speaking, there is no plan B.
Yeah, so developing systems that are more robust, more flexible.
Yeah, resilient and adaptive, so that a bit like the internet. You know, my husband, who is a developer, likes to say that the internet regards censorship as damage, and it just routes around it. Right.
Yeah.
Because it's that network structure.
Yes.
It just goes, oh, that one doesn't work. Right. Well, I'll just go over here then. But then we don't have our society set up that way.
Our society is more linear, so if anything, like a domino, if anything knocks over, then it just trips on down the line.
Exactly. Lots and lots of dominoes all over the place. So, and it doesn't just knock down one, sometimes it will knock down 6.
Yes. Yeah.
Then everything's gone. So yeah, so that's what I mean by brittle. It's kind of a it's strong while it works, but the second that it
Okay.
Dominoes.
Domino effect, yeah. Cool. Okay, so we've looked at things that we think will work and actually don't, like walls and borders. Well, not borders, but yeah. And talked about things that might work better, like membranes and a global body that would have the same definition of what it means to be a refugee. And then, these more environmental ways of looking at things, the carbon tax, I'm particularly like, wow, it's a bit mental.
So the dividends, so that everybody gets the same dividends.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So someone who is in, you know, Sierra Leone is getting exactly the same amount from those dividends as someone in Totnes.
Right, yeah.
Am I pronouncing that right? Is it Totnes?
Well, I say Totnes, yeah, but actual Totnesians say Totnes.
Totnes.
Totnes. We love her. I'm from Totnes. Yeah.
But it's the same amount of money either way, except it doesn't go quite as far.
It doesn't, not in Totnes. Totnes.
As it would as here on the Oats. So,
Yes.
you know, in some ways it might be better off staying actually, you know, where they are.
Yes, yeah.
From something like that. So
that makes a lot of sense.
But yeah, it's kind of trying to put, if I try and describe it as how I picture it, it's kind of putting a floor in that hopefully removes some of the pressure that's kind of pushing people out.
Right.
So, you know, so that they can actually build where they are.
Yes.
Along with making a clear story so they know what they're actually getting themselves in for if they, you know, if they choose to leave, so that they can make better decisions, right? If they can make better decisions, then the people that are coming through will hopefully go, okay, this is a sensible thing, so I don't need to do scary stuff like, you know, one of the things that was kind of mentioned a fair bit in Australia when this was all blowing up was, you know, people getting accused of throwing their passports, you know, losing their passports.
Yes.
So that, you know, they'd have a better chance to meet refugee status. You know, they wouldn't actually necessarily need to do that. Do you know what I mean? Because if it actually really was a good decision for them to leave, then chances are higher that they would be accepted, because that, you know, it was a good decision, so they should fall more easily into the definition of someone who really needed to leave. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that very well, but
I understand it. I get it, yeah.
Yeah,
well,
it's basically, it's about alignment, I guess.
Pardon?
It's about alignment. So alignment between what they need to do and what the reality is.
Yes.
And, you know, between their perceptions of what reality is and what reality actually is.
Yes, yeah, and bringing those together more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Between their actual values and the host country's values, between, you know, what they have to offer and what the host country needs.
Yeah, nice. That feels like a really good positive note to end on, unless there's something that you want to bring in that I've forgotten.
I think we've pretty much covered it. Let me just have a quick look at something here.
Sure,
actually, do you want to take half a sec?
Pardon?
You want to just put on pause for half a sec? Let me go through. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so we've had a look and a think.
Yes. And there was just one thing that that stood out, which was a comment that I saw somewhere that I thought was really good, which was about taking work to where the refugees are, particularly when they're in the camps. A lot of those camps are actually in desert areas and so on. So why not associate where they are with something that needs to be done with learning new skills. So I'm not sure how many people would have heard of permaculture as an idea, but permaculture is something that has been used to help regreen various little desert parts. So I think it's something that's been done a little bit in Australia. It's certainly been done in Israel, and I think a few other areas as well. So, you know, if you know, this was something that they could participate in you know, around where they are in those camps, they could be learning those new skills. They could be, you know, like improving the value of the land that they're actually on. You know, maybe even helping to, you know, grow the food that's needed themselves, and to kind of get that sense of, you know, something that's sort of useful out of life again. So rather than sort of sitting there and just waiting, sort of be dealing with living things as well.
Yes. So. Yeah. And permaculture is another, it's a real systems thinking structure as well, isn't it? It's not just about growing green vegetables, but but a whole way of thinking about a system and the input and output and how we can contribute to that system so that good things happen, not just in terms of the land, but in terms of social relations and purpose and self-respect, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, we need to get some more, forests and, you know, like other ways of growing food and so on for resilience as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. That's all good.
Yeah. Not saying to put everyone to, you know, to work on like slave permaculture farms or anything, but
you would have to guard against that.
They might want to do. Pardon?
I was saying you would have to guard against that. I can imagine a lot of systems degenerate, don't they, into something negative quite easily. You'd have to make that system itself robust so that didn't happen.
Yeah, or at least leave it open for feedback and change and so on. So it'd be one of those things that's like, okay, you might try and start it off and that didn't work too well. Let's try something else.
Yes. Yeah. Good call. Brilliant. So,
really. I don't think we've solved the problems yet.
Well, I want to do it next time, Kylie, because you know this is just dragging on a bit now. I want it sorted.
What are we thinking?
But yeah, no, I love it. I love it that you've got these ideas. I love it that every time we talk, I have a better picture, a better story of how we can move forward positively in the world. And I really appreciate that in a time of chaos and uncertainty and not knowing. So yeah, thanks for that.
Well, I would like to hear more of your ideas to shoot them down too, because I think you could actually do a good job of that. We kind of end up with me just going blah 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 blah, and you're kind of going
Yeah, cool. I shall put my mind to that for next time. I'll give you some ideas and see what you make of them.
That sounds like a great idea.
Cool. All right, so let's say goodbye to our viewers and then we can say goodbye to each other. So thank you for showing up for this cat conversation. Let us know what you'd like to see me talk to people about in the future, and subscribe and help me out on Patreon if you feel so inclined. I'm going to switch from Patreon to something else as soon as Jordan Peterson and his crew have come up with an alternative. Based on the Sargon of Akkad thing, which you can find out about. But for now, yeah, Patreon is still going. And we'll see you next time. So yeah, let's say goodbye.
Thank you.